I want you to think about a place that calls to you, one that you are drawn to, whether that is a place from childhood or a place you want to go but have never been. Now imagine, since here in the Zoom room, we are all most likely academics, that you receive funds of, say, $250,000 or $500,000, right, to ethnographically study any place you want. Figure it out. Where would you start? Well, in sociology, although there are many different types of ethnography, including feminist ethnographies like institutional ethnography, etc., in sociology, there are two large traditions that loom over the field that dominate graduate training, that dominate research that is published in top journals, and that's the Chicago School style ethnography and global ethnography. And in this paper, I argue that while each of these traditions provides important insights into social life, place gets lost and backgrounded in each because modern Chicago School style ethnographies focus on people, while global ethnography focuses on processes. So too does time and history get told in particular ways in these two traditions. For modern Chicago School style ethnographies evoke history when they do so as context to understand the present. Global ethnography, on the other hand, uses history and time to pinpoint causal mechanisms or a brief comparison with an already completed history with the present. I'll present a third alternative, what I call situated ethnography, which consists of two distinct approaches. One is an emplaced field method, which sees place as constituted by multiple fields, bringing the importance of place into field analysis and importance of field analysis into urban sociology. And two, a place's situated history, which entails a reimagining of how scholars understand time as nonlinear and constant comparisons with the present. So in this talk, for the rest of the talk, what I'll do is I'll talk about what situated ethnography is and its two components, emplaced field method and a place's situated history. I'll then discuss how it compares to Chicago School style ethnography and global ethnography, including differences among these three with what they foreground, background, and assumptions. I will briefly, because we don't have enough time, but in the broader paper and in any Q&A, I can go in depth further. I'll talk about three ethnographies, one in each style, to illustrate these differences among types and also what they would have looked like if they would have taken a different approach. I'll end with a call to recognize how which ethnographic method we choose shapes our theorization of social life. So I use the term situated ethnography to encompass a set of two distinct approaches to the study of lived experiences in place. First is what I call an emplaced field method, which sees place as constituted by multiple fields in the Bourdieuian sense. It's centered on that idea that any given place doesn't belong to one set of participants. Second, what I call a place's situated history entails a reimagining of how scholars should write about history and time by combining three approaches: historical ethnography, understanding time as nonlinear, and constant comparisons with the present. So more specifically, what do I mean by an emplaced field method? So the emplaced field method focuses on how processes and forces shape varied aspects of social life across varied in-place field. It's a social arena defined by laws and struggles and cooperation among actors that occupy particular social and hierarchical positions. A field analysis requires examining the socio-historical context in which a social space and its various positions arose, as well as the actors that shape and are shaped by the field. It's not structurally determinate, rather it's structurally informed, as within the field there are, and I quote, spaces of possibility where actors informed by their habitus make strategic decisions. And so it's important, often what's get lost, there's a lot of work on different types of capital, but really for Bourdieu, capital, habitus, and the field were interconnected, right? So in thinking of emplaced fields, I combine Bourdieu with insights from urban sociology. As Cochrane, Abrams, and Wynne note, and I quote, Bourdieu invites us to think about site effects, or how place shapes social positions and power, but Bourdieu also cautions against limiting our analysis to physical and geographic space. Yet place is central to social life according to urban sociology, and place has three necessary characteristics, right? Geographic location, material form, and investing with meaning and value. It's important to study precisely because all of our social processes, like inequality, among others, are emplaced. right? And here is kind of Guerin's annual review of sociology about the space for place in sociology. So places can become battlegrounds of meaning regarding who belongs and who doesn't, among other conflicts. However, I would argue that in many contemporary urban ethnographies, place often falls to the background rather than being highlighted as an independent social actor or the primary analytic focus. Of course, there are exceptions. There have been moves in fieldwork recently to analytically give weight to two or more different sets of actors in the vein of classic Chicago school. So here I'm thinking of Marco Garrido's work, Waverly Duck, Fred Weary, and or recenter place as the focal lens, right? And so here I'm thinking of Elijah Anderson, Mario Small, Forrest Stewart. And here, situated ethnography follows in classic urban ethnography and community study by recentering place as its focal point and emphasis on the social multiple worlds within it. Understanding how, why, and what forms fields intersect are important for how place itself is constituted and shift scholarly attention from a more vertical analysis of how global forces shape life on the ground, which is the extended case method, right? That's global ethnography, and a more horizontal analysis that follows people and processes outward to local institutions that shape their lives. This is the extended place method. To how global and local and historical processes and forces interact within the multiple placed fields that occupy and at times intersect within a given place across time. So it's one place, multiple fields, multiple social actors. As such, an in-place field method entails more than a focus on different contexts, as most ethnographies analyze how participants operate across contexts and situations, and community studies tend to highlight how varied participants operate within a given place. So instead, this approach sees fields as converging and interacting in particular places, even if their logics transcend any given location. That is, this method sees place as constitutive of multiple fields, thus revealing the multiple layers of social life and activity within a particular place. So, elaborating a little bit more about what I mean about situated ethnography is about writing time and history as nonlinear. This consists of three parts. First, historical ethnography, or the focus is on in-the-moment decisions made by people in their socio-historical and political circumstances. Here is the work of Diane Vaughan, for example, Marcus Anthony Hunter's first book. In historical ethnographies, researchers try to understand a past event, place, people, and their transformation over a particular period of time from the ground up. As historical ethnographers, scholars attempt to understand not only the complex lives of people and places studied, but also the causes, consequences, and reasonings for their action. That is, they focus on mechanisms, processes, and collective memories of events and communities located in another place and time than the researcher. And they use archives, whether it's documents, photos, similar material objects, and oral histories and interviews for data. So for most contemporary ethnographers, on the other hand, the historical element serves as a background context, right, and or a basis of a type of comparative ethnographic revisit, according to Bourvouet, to supplement what is occurring in the present day, right? It's more supplementary. However, these ethnographic revisits, as Bourvouet writes, and how ethnographers use them are more broad summaries and generalizations of previously researched social life in the past, rather than reanalyzing and highlighting specific social lives, situations, and conflicts of the past, a la historical ethnography, though there are a few exceptions. Approaching time as nonlinear is the second component of a situated historical approach. Social theorists in the tradition of Black feminist thought have long argued that the past lives on in the present by linking the historical and contemporary struggles and experiences of Black women and men and the racist social structures that govern everyday life. From Maya Angelou, Patricia Collins, Audre Lorde, to, for example, Jean Beeman, who discusses how the colonial lives on and shapes second-generation Mahibre origin children in France. As she notes about one of her respondents, and I quote, Diana conveys how her existence in France stems from its colonial relationship with Algeria. This history that is both intertwined with and separate from her everyday life in France. Part of their connection to their Algerian culture requires acknowledging the colonial relationship and its psychological and material consequences for Algerian immigrants and their descendants. Women of color and transnational feminisms and scholars writing in these traditions similarly see the past as living and experienced alongside the present, and the need to understand history as a study of power and as still present in the moment. So I'm happy to go more in depth in the Q&A, and I want to know that this table and paper is not advocating that we shouldn't use or write about history as causality, mechanisms. Instead, this paper provides a way to think about causality and mechanisms in light of women of color feminisms and as against a universalizing view of history. Linda Tuahi Smith argues, for example, that history is traditionally conceived of as totalizing, universal, chronological, about development, about a self-actualizing human subject, which historically, and you see even today, people of color have not been seen as. That is, it is one coherent narrative constructed around binary categories, patriarchal, and is thus an imperial project. In these works, the past is not context or studied to pinpoint causal mechanisms that enact a change. It is living and breathing. The collective weight of history is experienced in the present and used to advance community goals. Time and history are reoccurring and non-linear. So finally, the third part of thinking about time and history in the approach I'm proposing are constant comparisons between history and the contemporary, with an eye on the contemporary towards how history is experienced in the present. This constant comparison is because an ethnography of the present is equally important as historical ethnography. The process of being there, right? Talking, getting to know people, comparing what they say to what they do, walking around, visiting places, experiencing and witnessing ease of or burden to access and security, for example, is essential. The physical experience of being in the field informs scholars' analysis of the past, present, and even future, and their continuities and discontinuities. In doing so, it is comparative across time and fields, and uses this insight to offer an ethnographic way to non-linearly analyze social life and connect how the past and present are entwined. So this table is a little overwhelming, I'm sure. And here I want to kind of go over a few key characteristics and assumptions. In the paper, I go more in depth about how exactly each of these three ethnographies fits this. I will gesture to it in just a couple of minutes, but here I just want to go over the table. So when we compare ethnographic approaches, this is what I suggest. So the extended case method is rooted in the Manchester School and extensions from the Berkeley School and global ethnography more general. What this foregrounds is processes, and what it backgrounds is how thick description of particular people and their lives, right? Local place as a social actor, right? Thinking about cities, about neighborhoods rather than a country as a whole. And this shapes the types of questions asked, right? How larger processes and forces shape particular people and places. Comparisons, right, in global ethnography and an extended case method have an explicit focus on the macro-micro link, where how people kind of relate to broader structural processes vis-a-vis global forces and processes, and it tends to focus on the macro structure, for example, colonialism, and builds down to the micro, right? It's top down. History then becomes an explanation for the how and why of the present, tend to focus on global histories of empire, capitalism, etc., and how that has affected contemporary conditions. And there may be brief historical comparisons vis-a-vis an ethnographic revisit, but as I mentioned before, these histories are told as completed. Place then becomes a place where larger forces play out. The extended place method, rooted in the Chicago School, right? And here really thinking about modern interpretations, again, of the Chicago School rather than more classical. I would argue that this style foregrounds people. right? What it backgrounds, though, is global processes, history as living, and people without any connection to primary participants, right? We usually see traditional ethnographies in this way. You have a certain group of people and you follow them. People without connection to primary participants are backgrounded. The kinds of questions asked in this method follow people across different situations, different aspects of participants' lives, kind of thinking about moral orders and boundary making, how people make sense of the world. Comparisons are targeted and situational. Localized structural forces is how people or scholars tend to focus on the macro-micro link. So here at the city or neighborhood level, and tends to start from the micro and build up to the macro structural. Right? History then becomes an explanation for how and why of the present and tends to focus on relatively local histories. Place then becomes the context that structures particular people's lives. The emplaced field method for situated ethnography then foregrounds place as the central kind of focus of analysis. In doing so, right, you can't do everything in all these methods. What it backgrounds then is very thick description of people and their lives. There's still description, you still get to go and know people, but it backgrounds that. The types of questions asked here about the different social worlds located in a particular place over time. Comparisons are across time and context, right? So it's not just one context, but involves very many different people and actors. And the macro-micro link starts with the meso, right, place, and links up to the macro and down to the micro simultaneously. In doing so, sees history as living and breathing, and historical and contemporary ethnography are conducted simultaneously. Place then becomes the focus of study. So here again, I am less interested in saying that one method or one approach is better or worse than the other. My focus is on how do our methods help shape our questions, our data, and how we can theorize, and that different types of methods focus and allow different types of questions to be asked. So here, in the broader paper, I turn to highlighting these comparisons in actual text to give some life to how these are. And first is Mitch Denier's Sidewalk. And this is kind of it's 1999, so it's 25 years old still. It's considered a classic kind of text in sociology and in urban sociology in particular. And also as type of disclosure, conflict of interest, I actually learned ethnography from Mitch. And so there is that connection. So I just want to kind of put that up front. So here, I would argue that this approach's primary analytic focus is on people. And furthermore, this method sees place as a context that structures people's lives, right? Sidewalk tackles a very different setting than the other two books I'll discuss, but I use it as an exemplar of the extended case method in contemporary Chicago school ethnographies to highlight and follow methods and their accompanying theoretical insight. Highlighting hypothetical comparisons with how a situated approach would differ and allows us to see broader theoretical insights is important for understanding how knowledge is produced. So in following the lives of 20 Black men and one Filipino woman who work and live on 6th Avenue, Denier provides an in-depth portrait of the social life of the sidewalk located along 6th Avenue within Greenwich Village, New York. In doing so, his main focus is on people. They are the primary focus and what's foregrounded in the text. The people drive the research questions. How are moral orders created on the sidewalk? What are their constraints, opportunities, and livelihoods? Comparisons come about in their jobs, right? So book vendors, magazine vendors, or men without accounts, and personal stories and decision-making processes. Comparisons also come into play as Denier follows them across time throughout the years of his fieldwork. and through theoretical comparisons with Jane Jacobs' work on public characters and eyes on the street model, and with Wilson and Kellig's broken windows theory, which has been debunked. Empirically, he also makes comparisons across situations in race on his chapter on the white romp family and in his own interactions with police, right? Denier calls this extended place method, and he says that this is necessary to understand the sidewalk. And I quote, "That place could only be a starting point. Later, I needed to move my fieldwork on out across spaces to some of the other places where things had happened that had a role in making 6th Avenue what it is, including restaurants, parks, the Amtrak station, where some of the men used to sleep." Here, you could see how history comes an explanation of how and why of the present through changes in policies related to the unhoused in the Amtrak station and the formal and informal regulations of 6th Avenue. What is backgrounded are larger structural forces, such as racial capitalism and changes in the global economy, and other aspects of social life that occur on 6th Avenue. To be sure, Denier interviews and visits restaurants and parks, but he does so with an eye towards how they relate to his interlocutors, rather than how they connect to 6th Avenue as a particular place. What would Sidewalk look like if Denier used situated ethnography? Well, questions in this tradition would focus on the place itself, the various positionalities of communities and the researchers within, around, and denied access to, how 6th Avenue is embodied across these communities, as well as how different people make connections or not across time and history of the place, people formally within, around, and denied access to it, and themselves. So, for example, it would ask, what is the history of 6th Avenue? What are the mechanisms that underlie the changes that occurred? To what extent did this transformation entrench or alleviate inequities? Who are the people who work at the fast food restaurants across from the vendors who work there? Who are the people who live on or near 6th Avenue? What laws help structure 6th Avenue as a particular type of place previously and contemporarily? For example, situated ethnography would examine sidewalk book vendors, magazine vendors, and men without accounts as only one aspect of Greenwich Village. Denier would have selected at least one or more fields for intensive study, whether some of the businesses or fields that Denier refers to, such as the business improvement districts, park infrastructures, police, etc., or others. And while Denier, to be clear, evoked these other places, he did so only in relation to their effects on sidewalk vendors, rather than interrogating those businesses as fields structured by their own logics, competitions, and cooperation that are simultaneously emplaced at 6th Avenue while transcending 6th Avenue to larger corporation and global markets. A key difference between Denier's approach and situated ethnography is that in the latter, these other fields are given equal analytic weight to the people on the sidewalk to understand whether and how these varied fields within Greenwich Village are connected and change over time. He also would have uncovered the negotiations and issues of the past. And to be sure, Denier evokes Jane Jacobs' work, yet the comparison is used to only illustrate strategic differences, for example, of how who is considered a public figure and why, and whose, and I quote, eyes on the street matter for which people is racialized, rather than as the focal point of the research. The comparisons to Jacobs' work are evocations of the past she studied and don't constitute a historical ethnography. That is, Denier does not try to understand the lived experiences of people who formerly lived within or near 6th Avenue, nor does he interrogate how the people in the past haunt and shape the present. Denier mentions his positionality as a Jewish man when explaining how he overheard two interlocutors mentioning his religion when he left a tape recorder on and was not around. And here Denier makes an important point, that as researchers, we never truly know how our interlocutors perceive us. Nevertheless, he fails to consider how his embodiment as a white man with a PhD shapes his access to the sidewalk, as well as the additional locations he visits, the people he talks with as part of the extended field place method. A situated approach, in contrast, would center his positionality in ways as well as to show how his positionality, including not only race, class, and gender, as well as graduate training, PhD institution, among others, shapes his research questions, theoretical orientations, analysis, and decisions with regard to reading excerpts of the book to his interlocutors. These are necessary to consider in order to understand how, why, and under what circumstances the book itself and how knowledge more generally is produced. Next, I want to interrogate Specter of global China. And here, global ethnography and the extended case method focuses on how global processes are enacted on the ground. Through C.K. Lee's 2017 Specter of Global China, I'll demonstrate kind of the extended case method and how it differs, right? Lee provides a historically grounded comparison of Chinese state-owned, non-Chinese foreign-owned, and Zambian-owned mining and construction companies. Her main focus is on processes, which drives her main research questions. Is China state capital a different kind of capital? How do different logics of capital operate? What are the processes and mechanisms behind these differences? And it leads her to theorize about varieties of capitals and how their accumulation, production, and ethos drive differences observed. As such, comparisons in type of company and in which industry are part of her research design. She uses global ethnography and the extended case method to understand the macro-micro link by, and I quote, setting local and current relations in the context of the historical past and forging an explanation that takes into account the meanings of social action. The macro domain is accessed through theoretical and historical extensions from the concrete sites of participant observation. So that is, history is context, one that's global and serves as a comparison. This is done through a discussion of Zambia's colonial past and evoking Borwe's work on Zambian mine industry as a type of ethnographic revisit from which her contemporary fieldwork can be compared. Lee does not conduct a historical ethnography, that is, revisiting archives to uncover the dynamics of the past. Rather, she analyzes an already analyzed past. And here, Lee's focus on place revolves around Zambia as a country and in the descriptions of the working conditions of each industry, rather than distinct people in place, right, at the city or neighborhood level involved in these sites. Lee does include extensive quotes and 2 extended vignettes of people in her chapter on managerial ethos. However, because her focus is on processes, we don't get to know the background and lives of these people. Instead, we get broad aggregations of context and extended quotes to demonstrate how what people say and how they live relate to the process of interest, and how we know little about the places she studied transformed over time, whether these transformations are crucial for understanding contemporary life. And similarly, in her book, the site becomes a stand-in for the country of Zambia as a certain type of place, rather than interrogating how cities and neighborhoods within the country have different histories, politics, and socioeconomic features, which would better help us understand how Chinese capital becomes emplaced. So what would Spectre of Global China look like if Lee had approached it using situated ethnography? Right? A situated ethnography approach would focus on the place itself and the varied positionalities of the communities and the researcher herself within, around, and denied access to. What kind of place is this? What was it before a special economic zone? How and why did it transfer? In what ways did transformations change the place's relationship to its surrounding city and people? In what ways did these changes further reify inequities? What kinds of rules of laws? Right? Lee would have focused on gathering a wide range of data on its current and previous iteration, not only through the government and legal documents and ethnographic observations and participation she did, but also through newspapers, photographs, oral histories, poems, literatures, additional forms of knowledge production that are often discounted and dismissed in academic settings as not rigorous data, but which provide important cultural and political insights into everyday across fields, including how people differently understand time, right? Lee also would also not have focused only on work, but at least one other field, right? And to be sure, Lee makes references to housing attached to these companies, et cetera. And yet these comparisons are used to only illustrate strategic differences between how housing is organized broadly across industry and capital, rather than interrogating the canteens or cafeterias and housing and how these operate as social worlds themselves, right? And here she would also talk about positionality in a very different way. Lee states that as a sociologist, my own social position constrained my access to the power elite, that is state and capital, whereas the Zambian working class, like their Chinese counterparts, are more amenable to being studied. And so while she encountered difficulty getting access to her field site, she also recognized her luck, quote unquote, when her educational credentials and scholarly critiques of Chinese business practices helped make a connection with a politician who would soon become vice president. This politician, Mr. Guy Scott, is a white Zambian born to a Scottish father and English mother in northern Rhodesia, the name of the British protectorate that would be named Zambia after independence. And although Lee names him as part of the oppositional political party, she doesn't mention his explicit anti-Chinese business stance, how that may have shaped why he supported her work. And although she elaborates on how Scott's support did not mean that everyone gave her equal access to themselves or their work, she does not interrogate how having the support of such a powerful political player influenced what people shared or did not, right? And here, she also talks about respect and fear going towards kind of the differences of how people relate to her. But this raises concerns. Why would respect and fear be things that you would want to do in the field site, right? How are you defining respect? Why would fear be a feeling that the researcher wants to evoke? And without interrogating why or how her presence is related to broader geopolitical struggles and her relationship with the soon-to-be vice president, we lose sight of how her access fundamentally shaped her work, right? In contrast, a situated ethnography approach is grounded in the understanding positionality essential to all aspects of the research process. Because situated ethnography is rooted in women of color feminism, the researcher using this approach realizes that positionality is a particular social and structural position that gives insight from that location and shifts. This structural position shifts across time, fields, places, and interactions. And finally, and quickly, I'll go over my first book. It begins with the local place, its history and how it fits in with the broader national political economy, and follows place in its historical context, right? So here I tackle the place of Subic Bay, Philippines, which was home of a U.S. former military base and now its current special economic zones. It opens with an introduction, this idea of the new analytic space of global borderlands, which are places that are legally plural and ambiguous places of international exchange whose foundations are built on inequality. They include places like overseas military bases, special economic zones, embassies, international branch campuses, and the like. And here I examine multiple social arenas or fields. Each chapter captures a particular set of actors within a different field. So for example, whether US military and Philippine government officials negotiating base treaties, the worlds of work and consumption within the Freeport Zone, the intimate lives of US military men, Philippine women, among others. My work does not stop there. I don't relegate history to a specific chapter that readers need to understand to know the rest. Instead, in each chapter, I analyze it alongside contemporary social life, right? To understand how interlocutors understood time and the connections and disruptions between the past and present. I focus on place and the various positionalities of the communities within, around, and denied access, right? This drives research questions like, what kind of place is this? How is place related to sovereignty? How is sovereignty enacted and experienced on the ground and in daily life? How does the power within a military base compare with the power within a special economic zone? How do different groups of people negotiate and make meaning in the face of deep structural inequality among nation states exemplified through these places? Comparisons are across time, history, and present, and place social field, and to the extent to which they intersect. So whether it's intimacy, taxes, military agreement, criminal cases, work consumption, Amerasian children, and the types of people across race, nationality, gender, and sexuality, and class, and how these relate to power. In this way, right, I'm focusing on place and going up and down. History is not just context or background. It's living and in the present and directly compared. So each chapter actively compares the past to the present, interrogating what has changed and what has remained the same. It documents how people see history as commingled with the present, while rooting the past in the lives of specific people and the conflicts of that time, rather than relying on more general narrations of the past. Right, and so what is backgrounded as thick description, sustained field work. To be clear, I did conduct field work. I got to know people, but it is backgrounded in my kind of analysis. And here, and again, I can kind of answer more questions specifically. But I just want to say that what does this approach do? It recenters place as a social actor and theoretically and methodologically advances understanding of place as constituted by multiple social worlds. Ethnographically understand and write about time and history as nonlinear. As such, it provides both novel methodological advancements in the field of ethnography and theoretical contributions to the relationship between place and field theory and understanding the role of nonlinear time in social life. And again, the purpose isn't to discount either the Chicago style school or global ethnography. Rather, it's to understand that the methods we choose shape what we see, shape the questions we ask, shape what we pay attention to, and how we analyze social life. It's only with the partial and understanding the partial nature of methods and of research that we can really understand broader life more generally. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Victoria, for that great talk. I'm going to send the feedback survey into the chat. So if everyone has an opportunity, please just take 1 quick minute to do that before leaving the meeting. And we'll open the Q&A right away. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to or send them into the chat or raise your hand, whichever makes most sense.
I can start. Apologies for my voice. I I was intrigued by your comment at the beginning that this came about through a meeting with critics of your work, and so I was curious to hear a bit more about that, about sort of what people took away from reading sort of first of its kind situated ethnography, and what stuck out about some of the feedback that you were getting.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question. So specifically, it was Michael Kennedy, who was a professor of sociology and I believe international studies. He's at Brown University, and he was one of my author meets critics. And he is a global transnational sociologist, also does knowledge production. The others were Ashley Mears, who is at BU, and she is an economic sociologist, and Meredith Kemp, who is at University of Maryland, and she is a sociology of the military person. And so Michael Kennedy was really, I hadn't thought about writing a methodological piece, and he is the one who really talked about how, just from reading the book, that it was quite different approach to thinking about global ethnography and just in general how ethnography is taught. And so it was actually very positive. I mean, I think author meets critics sessions, unless the book is very highly controversial. Here I'm thinking, for example, of Alison Goffman had author meets critic at the American Sociological Association when her book came out. And a lot those comments were much more critical. I found in the author meets critics sessions that I've had for both my books to be very constructive and to be very positive. So the response was well, and Michael was the one who really kind of encouraged me to think deeply about how I was thinking about ethnography, particularly given that I was trained by Mitch Denier in kind of Chicago school, not global ethnography, right? I read about global ethnography on my own and how I wasn't quite doing any of this, right? And so the receptions have been really positive. The book itself received, I think, 9 recognitions, mostly honorable mentions, but it received 9 kind of awards. But it's also, it doesn't quite fit. This is my work more generally. My work doesn't quite fit in any standard category or box. You can't quite easily categorize it. And in that way, I think, in one hand, doing this kind of ethnography can sometimes take twice the work because you're doing 2 different types of ethnography, but then you're also doing it in different areas of understanding, right? So I do kind of 6 different kind of contexts. And so one thing that we would take away, especially for qualitative researcher, is this emphasis to really emphasize quality, innovation, slow thinking, rather than the publish or perish mindset where, okay, I'm in the field, And even though fieldwork in general is much kind of allows people to go slower, okay, I'm in the field a year, I have to write it up, and here is this particular person. I just think that this kind of method challenges a focus on quick and easier, because research in general, any kind of ethnography is not easy, but has less moving parts and can publish more rather than kind of thinking through methodologically. And that's kind of my critique of sociological methods and sociology more general. One of them is kind of, and the disciplines as a whole, I think across social sciences and humanities and probably the natural sciences, is just this focus on being quick and just get enough kind of data to write something. Whereas really thinking through these issues require people to slow down. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, definitely.
I'd also like to jump in with a quick question. So I'm currently taking a literature course about fiction and place, and it highlights literature specific to Southern Ontario and Hamilton. And Hamilton is kind of an interesting city because historically it was very industrial, a lot of steel mills in the North End, and it looks very different now. After the steel mills shut down, or a lot of them did, the city has like more of an artistic field now or an academic field because of the university. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the constant comparisons or what understanding the history of a place might look like. That seems to go through kind of two lives or a lot of change.
Yeah, that's a great question. And here, before I answer it, I just to kind of want to make the point in a little bit different ways is I actually think we can study anything using any kind of method and any kind of theoretical framework, that it's really about what are the things we're reading and writing and thinking about. And so for here, how would I approach this, right? Well, one, I would be interested in thinking about, say, for example, you want to understand work, compare work practices in terms of the industry, mill, how that organized, the economy. And you could do that through newspapers, through oral histories. You could do that through kind of even process tracing, how it became an industrial town, how and why capitalism kind of shaped that. The data you can get, I mean, is on that and like literature written about that time, right? Whereas in the present, maybe you're focusing on, okay, once the mill shut down, how did they get kind of a university? So one comparison could also be, I would imagine, right, is that, workers in the industrial town were from local people, right? Local communities who were then forced out because the university is gentrifying the area. And so now it's part of kind of, I'd imagine the class spatial dynamics are quite different, right? And so it's thinking about what are things that are parallel. So for example, a military base in a special economic zone, you wouldn't quite necessarily think to compare them, but for one chapter I compared military bases and tax laws, right? Military base agreements and how these were negotiated. So not only the agreements themselves, but I also found like, what are they called? Telegrams and all of this information between US military officials among themselves, as well as the Philippines, right? And thinking, I was really interested in how did they negotiate, like whose land was who, and actually it's really important to understand there are different kinds of military bases and who pays for what, and how sovereignty is in fact contingent and it depends on various different things. And so when I was thinking about the Freeport zone, what could be an equivalent was these tax-free incentives. How are these negotiated, right? And part of this stems from my interest in sovereignty, right? And so that's kind of the thorough line of sovereignty and kind of cultural meaning making. So I think that thinking about the fields you're interested in, right? What is it about the past and present that you're interested in comparing? And it's really through talking with people, but it's also kind of trusting yourself. I've had my work, people Like I didn't really quite have a model for how to structure my book, but I knew I wanted to compare these two, even though everyone told me taxes are boring. Military base agreements and these negotiations are boring. But for me, I saw how these tiny negotiations really tells us about the limits and contours of sovereignty, right? So if you're thinking about that, what are you interested in? Are you interested in kind of gentrification? Are you interested? So thinking about both the processes and topics, and then trying to think about how would you study that here in the past as an industry town and as a university. I don't know if that quite answered your question or not, but I also think talking with people, so McCutcheon's, and I'm forgetting her co-author's name, they talk about something called kitchen talk reflexivity and kitchen table talk, and how this is important because this is talking with fellow academics and having kind of a check on like how we're analyzing things. And that is a very important source of knowledge production and thinking about how we're analyzing our data.
Thank you. Yeah, that definitely answers my question and gives me a lot to think about.
Awesome.
If no one else jump in, I would like to ask you a question. Thank you for your talk and sharing your perspective on positionality and the ways it can shape our research approaches. I'm curious if you're comfortable sharing, how do you see your own positionality influencing your work and the interpretation you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I have this methods paper from 2020 that I'm really interested in writing, like my methods and methodology writings are what get me citations and what I tend to get known for rather than the substantive content, which is a funny aside. I talk about something called the Ethnographic Toolkit. And here I talk about how researchers, we all have visible and invisible tools and backgrounds and knowledges and positionalities that change. So when I'm in the Philippines, yes, I'm Filipina American. In my book, I talk about this. I start off the preface, for example, with a story about my grandma. So my mom had me when she was 15. My mom was born in the Philippines. My grandma had her at 19. And my grandma migrated to the US through marriage to a US serviceman. And that is kind of how she raised me. And so that is how I grew up. And she was very much like, you're an American. And so when I started taking Tagalog classes, because she refused to teach us, I did a Fulbright, I did a heritage program in the Philippines. And when I'm there, I still have family in Subic Bay. My Tita Linda, helped me navigate bureaucracies. And I think what's really important is so when I talked with both sex workers as well as mothers of Amerasian children who had US servicemen as fathers, is I would relate as talking about my grandma and her migration. She's often seen as a sex worker by people who migrate in similar circumstances. But I also understand how when I try to match, right? Researchers, often positionality and reflexivity are considered kind of in writings, oh, I'm X, therefore I got access. But instead, I shift to kind of understanding this as relational and that we have these tools that we highlight or we don't in particular circumstances. And sometimes those aren't matched, right? I would try to talk, give an interview in Tagalog to a Filipino government official, and he would speak in English, right? Like it was very clear he was not interested. And so in that way, kind of the ways in which we perform or present ourselves is not static, it's relational. And very much thinking about, if I were to write the book now, I'd write a very different book than I did before. And I think for me, that's a sign of intellectual growth. I would have kind of interrogated things much more. But I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that even if we share some characteristics with people we study, by our training, by being a researcher studying it, there is no true insider, right? Like I don't believe that there are any insiders, and kind of essentialist understandings of how our characteristics shape our access. It's really harmful, but it's the default when people say, well, I'm from X community and therefore I have this kind of access. And I also, so I write a lot about thinking about power, thinking about all of these things. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes, it was actually, this was another question that emerged, a question of powers. Power, I imagine they were important during your study relating to your positionality with the people you were working with.
Yeah. And so it actually crossed. I studied down, horizontal, up, right? So Filipino officials, right, are up, court officials, right? And actually I had to get my tita to help me navigate because I got permission from the local government, but then they got mad when they heard me, I was interviewing and I was like, I asked permission, whatever. So my tita helped me, right? And they were impressed by like my credentials of a Princeton PhD. And then I did kind of businessmen and businesswomen kind of who own companies within the Freeport zone or other academics. And then people who, have a kind of lower socioeconomic status, all of these things. For those, I would kind of give, for everyone, but it would differ kind of these kind of a thank you, right? Or buy food, or like I spent the night, and this woman who was a former sex worker, I stayed the night in a few nights in her house, and she cooked me chicken feet. And I think, and I had another woman who like helped walk around, and she was much more poor, and my family is poor there. And when I go there, I always give money. So it's this kind of balancing, because on one hand, I think actually research is inherently extractive. There is no getting over that we are taking knowledge from others and producing our own for our own kind of career. And so then it's about, yeah. And so it's thinking, I don't know, now I would probably, this book was published, and then you can see fieldwork was much earlier, but published in 2019. So it's well away. And I think I might have done like positionality differently, and I think that power is fluid too. Like it wasn't just, I'm an American and therefore I had all the power in all of the situations, right? And so I think kind of that even though it seems reflexive, I think that we can unintentionally perpetuate a form of essentialism if we say that. So it's tricky navigating, right? It's tricky navigating, bring house gifts, you give these things and you try to relate and extract and give back what you can. Yeah. But I'm not one of these people. I know that there's a book recently who are like, I won't even give kids food if they're asking. That wasn't me, like I would buy meals. And I think that it's really important to like, these are humans, right? And like, I think, and that book is getting a lot of attention. And I actually think that's quite an exploitative stance to take, that if a child is hungry and asking for food and you reject it because in some name of being unbiased, I think we're never unbiased. We're never kind of, there's no such thing, right?
Thank you so much. I think you illustrated very well the originality of opposition. Thank you.